In the heart of Montana's Paradise Valley, where the Absaroka Mountains pierce the autumn sky like jagged teeth, a wealthy cattle baron named William Hartley made a wager that would shake the foundation of everything he believed. His challenge was simple, brutal, and seemingly impossible. Ride his wild gray stallion, Thunder, for just 60 seconds, and walk away with $2 million. One by one, the best riders in 3 states tried and failed, leaving behind shattered bones and wounded egos. The corral became a graveyard of ambition, and William's pride swelled with each spectacular defeat. But when a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a leather journal stepped through the gate, everything William Hartley thought he knew about power, control, and what it means to truly master something wild was about to be torn apart and rebuilt from the ground up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September air in Paradise Valley carried the sharp bite of coming winter, though the afternoon sun still burned warm enough to draw sweat from a working man's back. The landscape stretched endless in every direction. Rolling grasslands painted gold and amber by the changing season, framed by mountains so massive they seemed to hold up the sky itself. The Yellowstone River cut through the valley like a silver ribbon, its waters running cold and fast with snowmelt from peaks already dusted white. This was big country, the kind that made a man feel small unless he worked very hard to convince himself otherwise. William Hartley had spent 67 years convincing himself otherwise. He stood now at the edge of his main corral, a structure built from split lodgepole pine that had weathered 40 Montana winters, watching the crowd gather with the satisfied air of a man who had orchestrated exactly what he intended. His ranch, the Hartley Crown, sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, a kingdom built by his grandfather's ruthless ambition, expanded by his father's shrewd business sense, and maintained by William's own iron will. The main house rose behind him, a sprawling lodge of timber and stone with antler chandeliers visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, a monument to 3 generations of dominance over this unforgiving land. He was a tall man, though age had begun to curve his spine slightly, with shoulders still broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that had never forgotten the feel of hard work, even if others did most of that work now. His face was carved from wind and sun, deep lines radiating from eyes the color of winter ice, a strong jaw gone slightly slack with age but still set with the kind of determination that had broken horses, men, and deals that others thought unbreakable. Silver hair curled from beneath a black Stetson that had cost more than most men in the valley earned in a month, and his boots were custom-made alligator leather, polished to a mirror shine despite the dust that covered everything else. The corral itself was packed with spectators, more than William had seen gather for anything short of a funeral or a wedding. They lined the rails 3 deep, perched on fence posts, stood in pickup truck beds, and spread out across the adjacent pasture like some strange carnival had come to town. Which, in a way, it had. Word of William Hartley's $2 million bet had spread through the valley like wildfire, jumping from the Cattlemen's Association dinner, where he'd made the wager, to every diner, feed store, and bar within 100 miles. Now they'd come to watch, drawn by the spectacle of wealth, the promise of violence, and the deep human hunger to see the impossible attempted. The smell of the gathering was distinct and layered. Fresh coffee from thermoses mixed with the sweeter scent of hot chocolate that mothers had brought for children who should have been in school but whose parents couldn't resist the draw of history being made. Wood smoke drifted from a barrel where someone had started a fire against the morning chill. The ever-present scent of sagebrush and pine underlaid everything, along with the earthier smells of horses, cattle, and the red dirt that gave the corral its distinctive color. Someone had brought a grill, and the smell of frying bacon made William's stomach growl despite the tension coiling in his gut. Deputy Frank Morrison leaned against a fence post near William, his uniform jacket open despite the cold, a toothpick working between his teeth as he surveyed the crowd with the weary eye of a man who'd seen too many gatherings turn into problems. He was younger than William by a decade, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that looked perpetually skeptical. He'd known William since he was a boy, had worked summer jobs on the Hartley Crown before joining the sheriff's department, and had earned the right to speak his mind through years of loyalty and discretion. "This feels like trouble waiting to happen, William," Frank said. his voice pitched low enough that only the rancher could hear. "You've got 200 people here, money changing hands, and folks getting liquored up before noon. Someone's going to get hurt, and I don't just mean whoever's fool enough to climb on that animal." William didn't turn to look at him, keeping his gaze fixed on the corral where Thunder moved with restless energy. "People come of their own free will, Frank. I didn't force anyone to drive out here. I didn't force anyone to take my bet." "No, but you knew they would. You made that announcement at the association dinner because you knew every rancher in 3 counties would hear about it by sunrise. You wanted this circus." Now William did turn, and his smile was sharp enough to cut. "What I want is to prove what I've always known, that there's no animal on this earth that can't be mastered by a man with enough will and strength. Thunder there, he's the perfect example. Wild caught from the prior mountains 2 years ago, and in all that time not one rider has managed to stay on his back for more than a handful of seconds. He's become a legend, Frank. Stories about him have traveled as far as Wyoming and Idaho. People say he can't be ridden. I say anything can be ridden if you're man enough. And if someone gets killed proving you wrong?" William's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Then they'll have died doing what they chose to do. We're not children here, Frank. Every man and woman who steps into that corral knows the risk." The deputy worked his toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other, studying William with eyes that had learned to read men as carefully as a tracker reads sign. "I wonder sometimes if you even hear yourself anymore. Your daddy, rest his soul, he was hard but he was fair. You've gotten harder every year since Margaret passed, and I'm not sure there's any fair left in you." The mention of his wife's name landed like a physical blow, though William's expression didn't change. Margaret Hartley had died 4 years ago, taken by cancer that had eaten through her with ruthless efficiency despite the best doctor's money could buy in Billings and Denver. She'd been the softness in his life, the voice that could talk him down from his rages, the hand that could gentle his pride. Without her, something in William had calcified, hardened into the unyielding thing he'd become. "Margaret's got nothing to do with this," William said, his voice gone cold and flat. "Doesn't she? Seems to me you've spent the last 4 years trying to prove you're harder than the thing that took her from you. But you can't intimidate death, William. You can't break it like a horse or stare it down like a rival. All you can do is make yourself meaner until nobody wants to be around you anymore." Before William could respond, a commotion at the corral drew both men's attention. The first challenger of the day was preparing to enter, and the crowd's murmur rose to a roar of anticipation. Jake Sullivan was 23 years old, all lean muscle and youthful arrogance, with the kind of pretty boy face that made mothers worry and daughters swoon. He'd won some small-time rodeos down in Billings, had a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate to prove it, and wore his confidence like armor as he vaulted over the fence and landed in the red dirt with a flourish that drew cheers and whistles. Thunder reacted to the intrusion immediately. The Stallion had been moving in lazy circles near the Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Far end of the corral, but now his head snapped up, ears pinning flat against his skull. He was a magnificent animal, standing just over 16 hands, with a coat of dappled gray that caught the light like hammered silver. Darker gray spots spread across his hindquarters like storm clouds, and his mane and tail were nearly white, flowing like water when he moved. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart, pale blue-gray, almost ghostly, with an intelligence in them that made men uncomfortable. The lightning bolt-shaped marking on his forehead seemed to pulse with its own energy, a warning written in nature's hand. Jake approached with the swagger of youth, one hand extended, making the soft clicking sounds that worked on ranch horses and rodeo broncs. The crowd fell silent, tension drawing tight as a bowstring. Thunder's nostrils flared, taking in the young man's scent, reading intentions that Jake himself probably didn't fully understand. For a moment, the tableau held perfectly still, man and beast measuring each other across 10 feet of red dirt. Then Jake lunged, trying to close the distance in a burst of speed, and Thunder exploded into motion. The Stallion spun with a violence that seemed to tear the air itself, his body becoming a blur of silver and white. Jake's fingers grazed the horse's mane but found no purchase. Thunder's shoulder caught him square in the chest, and the young man went flying backward, arms pinwheeling uselessly, before hitting the ground with a sound like a wet sack of grain being dropped. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a whooshing gasp that carried clearly in the sudden silence. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Jake rolled to his side, coughing and gasping, and the crowd released its held breath in a mixture of groans and nervous laughter. 2 ranch hands ducked through the fence to help him up, and Jake waved them off, pride wounded worse than his body, though William could see him favoring his left side as he limped toward the exit. The whole encounter had lasted perhaps 5 seconds. "Next," William called out, his voice carrying across the corral with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He felt a surge of satisfaction run through him, warm and vindictive. Each failure was proof, evidence that he'd been right all along, that Thunder was exactly what William claimed, untamable, impossible, a living testament to the superiority of the Hartley bloodline that could produce such an animal. The morning wore on, and the failures mounted like bodies on a battlefield. Carol Reed came all the way from Great Falls, a woman in her 50s with short-cropped gray hair and 30 years of professional horse training behind her. She'd broken horses for ranchers, trained show jumpers, and worked with traumatized rescue animals. She entered the corral with quiet competence. No showboating, no false bravado. She simply stood at the fence, watching Thunder move, studying him with the patient eye of an expert. She lasted longer than Jake had, managing to approach within a few feet before Thunder's ears went back and his lips curled away from yellowed teeth. Carol froze, reading the warning, and began to back away slowly. But Thunder had already made his decision. He lunged forward, teeth snapping inches from her shoulder, and Carol stumbled backward, catching her boot heel on an uneven patch of ground and going down hard. She rolled away as Thunder reared above her, his front hooves slashing the air where her head had been seconds before. The ranch hands pulled her out quickly, and she left without a word, face flushed with embarrassment and something that looked like genuine fear. Rick Coleman was next, a drifter who'd been riding broncs on the small-time rodeo circuit for 15 years. His face a roadmap of breaks and stitches, his body held together by surgical pins and stubborn refusal to quit. He approached Thunder with the fatalistic calm of a man who'd been thrown so many times that fear had become just another sensation to ignore. He made it onto Thunder's back through sheer audacity and speed, vaulting up before the stallion could react. For 3 glorious seconds, Rick stayed mounted, his body moving with the violent bucking, one hand gripping mane, the other thrown high for balance. The crowd roared, sensing that maybe, just maybe, this would be the one. But Thunder wasn't bucking in the wild, random pattern of a frightened animal. He was calculating, testing, and when he'd learned what he needed to know, he twisted his body in a corkscrew motion that physics said should be impossible for something that large. Rick separated from the horse's back and sailed through the air, landing in a heap against the fence rails with a crack that made everyone wince. He got up more slowly than Jake had, and William could see blood trickling from his nose as he limped away, but the drifter was grinning, high on adrenaline and the brief glory of those 3 seconds. By early afternoon, 7 challengers had tried and failed. The crowd had swelled to nearly 300 people, word spreading in real time through text messages and social media posts. Someone had set up a live stream, and William caught glimpses of people holding up phones, broadcasting his corral to the world. The whole thing had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond even his considerable ego's ambitions. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, there was a hollow quality to his satisfaction, like biting into beautiful fruit and finding it tasteless. Ethan Hartley stood near the main house, watching his father with an expression that mixed concern with barely concealed frustration. At 34, Ethan had his mother's softer features and kinder eyes, though he'd inherited his father's height and broad shoulders. He'd gone to college in Bozeman, studied ranch management and animal science, and come back full of ideas about sustainable practices, rotational grazing, and treating animals as partners rather than property. Every suggestion had been met with his father's stone wall of tradition and pride. Now Ethan approached, his boots crunching in the gravel, and stood beside William in silence for a moment before speaking. "Dad, this has gone far enough. Thunder's going to kill someone or hurt them bad enough it might as well be killing. Is your pride really worth that?" William didn't look at his son. "This isn't about pride. This is about truth. About proving what's possible when a man doesn't back down." "It's exactly about pride," Ethan shot back, frustration finally breaking through his usual careful diplomacy. "Everything's been about pride since Mom died. The expansion into the north pasture that we can't afford to maintain properly. The new breeding program that's costing us a fortune with no returns yet. And now this, turning a dangerous animal into a spectacle so you can prove something to people who don't even care." "I care," William said, his voice low and dangerous. "I care that people remember what it means to build something real in this world. Your mother understood that. She knew that everything we have came from not backing down, from being harder than the land, tougher than the competition, stronger than whatever tried to break us." "Mom understood love," Ethan said quietly. "She understood that strength without compassion is just cruelty, and she'd be heartbroken to see what you've become." The words hit harder than William wanted to admit, so he buried the pain under anger, letting rage coat the wound like callus over a blister. "You don't know what your mother would think, and unless you're planning to climb in there and ride that horse yourself, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself." Ethan stared at his father for a long moment, something dying in his eyes, then turned and walked away toward the barns. William watched him go and felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing, which amounted to the same thing in the end. The sun had begun its descent toward the mountains when Miguel Torres, the ranch foreman, appeared at William's elbow. Miguel was 55, compact and weathered, with hands that could doctor a sick calf or mend a fence with equal skill. He'd worked the Hartley crown for 23 years, had earned William's trust through loyalty and competence, and was one of the few people on the ranch who could speak plainly without facing immediate consequences. "Boss, we got a problem," Miguel said, his accent still carrying traces of the Mexican border town where he'd been born. "Thunder hasn't had water since this morning. With all these people and all this excitement, nobody's been able to get near him to fill his trough. He's going to dehydrate if this keeps up much longer." William frowned, the first crack in his carefully maintained facade of control. He hadn't considered the practical necessities, too focused on the spectacle and what it meant for his reputation. "Can't you just toss a bucket over the fence? He'll kick it over. You know how he is. Someone needs to go in calm, fill it proper while he's distracted. But with all these failed rides, he's too worked up. Won't let anyone close." Before William could respond, a commotion near the road drew everyone's attention. A battered Ford pickup, at least 20 years old with more rust than paint, pulled up in a cloud of dust. The crowd parted, curious about this late arrival, and a man climbed out of the cab with the unhurried movements of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing rarely improved outcomes. Ben Matthews didn't look like much at first glance. He was 42 but could have passed for older, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work without quite enough food or rest. Medium height, lean almost to the point of thin, with sandy brown hair going gray at the temples and hands that bore the calluses and scars of manual labor. He wore faded jeans, work boots that had been resoled at least once, and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. Under one arm, he carried a leather-bound journal, cracked and worn with age and use. The crowd's murmur changed quality, curiosity giving way to confusion and then to barely suppressed laughter. This weathered farmer looked about as likely to ride thunder as he did to sprout wings and fly. But Ben seemed unbothered by the attention, moving through the crowd with quiet purpose until he reached the corral fence and stood there, simply watching the gray stallion with patient, assessing eyes. William felt irritation flare in his chest. The spectacle had been building all day toward some kind of climax, and this shabby stranger threatened to turn it into comedy. He strode over, Miguel trailing behind, and addressed Ben with barely concealed condescension. "You're late to the party, friend. We've had 7 riders try already, and that horse has sent every one of them packing. Unless you've got $2 million burning a hole in your pocket, I'd suggest you save yourself the hospital bills and just watch from out here." Ben turned to look at William, and the rancher was struck by the clarity in the man's eyes. A deep brown that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. When Ben spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, with the measured cadence of someone who thought before speaking. "I'm not here to ride him, Mr. Hartley. At least not the way you mean. I'm here because I heard you've got a horse that nobody can reach, and I've got some experience with that kind of situation." Experience? William's laugh was sharp and dismissive. What kind of experience could you possibly have that 7 professional riders don't? Ben's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps amusement, perhaps pity. "The kind my grandfather taught me. He worked with the Crow Nation for 40 years, learning their ways with horses. Taught me before he passed that there's more than one way to reach an animal. Sometimes force is the problem, not the solution." The crowd had gone quiet, sensing drama in the making. William felt every eye on him, weighing his response, and his pride flared hot and defensive. This nobody farmer was challenging not just his methods but the entire foundation of everything William had built his life upon. "Your grandfather's Indian tricks might work on some broke-down plow horse, but Thunder there is different. He's wild, pure wild, and he respects only one thing, strength. You try your gentle nonsense with him, and he'll kill you as soon as look at you." Ben nodded slowly, as if William had confirmed something he'd suspected. "Maybe, but your way's been tried 7 times today, and it hasn't worked once. Seems like maybe it's time to try something different." "My way," William said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, "has built everything you see around you. 3 generations of Hartleys breaking this land and everything on it to our will. That's not something that changes because some drifter farmer shows up with a book of fairy tales." "Not fairy tales," Ben said quietly, opening the journal to show pages filled with careful sketches of horses, detailed anatomical drawings, and notes written in faded ink. "Knowledge, passed down from people who understood that partnership works better than domination. But if you're not interested, I can leave. Won't trouble you further." He moved to close the journal, and William felt a strange panic grip his chest. If this man left, the day would end in stalemate, 7 failures with no victor, no resolution, just a growing sense that maybe Thunder truly was unrideable. But if this farmer tried and failed like all the others, it would be the perfect capstone, proof that even the most alternative approaches couldn't succeed where traditional strength had fallen short. "Wait," William heard himself say, the word coming out before his pride could stop it. "You want to try, you go ahead. Same terms as everyone else. Stay on his back for 60 seconds, and you walk away with $2 million. Ben shook his head slowly. "I don't want your money, Mr. Hartley. I just want to try reaching him my way. If it works, maybe you'll consider that there's value in approaches you haven't tried before. If it doesn't, well, you'll have your proof that you were right all along." The crowd stirred, sensing something significant in this exchange. Deputy Morrison pushed forward through the press of bodies, his hand resting on his belt near his radio. "William, I strongly advise against this. We've already had injuries today. You let this man in there without proper safety measures, and you're liable for whatever happens." William barely heard him. His entire focus had narrowed to Ben Matthews and the quiet challenge in the farmer's eyes. This wasn't about money anymore, wasn't even really about Thunder. This was about 2 completely different philosophies of life meeting head-on in a red dirt corral in Paradise Valley, and William's soul demanded to know which would prove stronger. "The corral's open," William said. "Show me what your grandfather's wisdom can do against 1,500 pounds of pure wild fury." Ben nodded once, then carefully set his journal on a fence post, open to a page showing detailed sketches of horse body language and behavior. Then he climbed over the fence with surprising grace for a man his age and dropped into the corral. The crowd pressed forward, anticipation electric in the autumn air. Thunder stopped moving, his pale eyes fixing on this new challenger with an intensity that made several spectators step back involuntarily. And William Hartley, standing at the fence with his pride, his reputation, and everything he believed about strength and control hanging in the balance, felt the first cold touch of genuine doubt creep into his certainty. The corral fell into a silence so complete that the distant cry of a raven sounded loud as a gunshot. Ben Matthews stood just inside the fence, not moving toward Thunder, not making any of the aggressive gestures the previous challengers had employed. He simply stood there, weight balanced evenly on both feet, arms loose at his sides, breathing slowly and deliberately. The gray stallion watched him with those unsettling pale eyes, ears swiveling forward and back as if trying to decode this new puzzle. William studied the farmer more carefully now, looking for signs of fear or false bravado, but found neither. Ben's face held a quality of attention that reminded William of hunters he'd known. Men who could stand motionless for hours waiting for elk to emerge from the timber. There was patience in every line of his body, a willingness to exist in the moment without forcing it toward any particular outcome. It was alien to everything William understood about asserting dominance, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. The afternoon sun slanted through the lodgepole pines surrounding the corral, casting long shadows that stretched across the red dirt like dark fingers. The temperature had begun to drop as it always did in Montana when the sun started its descent, and William could see his breath beginning to ghost in the air. Around him, the crowd remained transfixed, 300 people holding a collective breath, waiting to see if the shabby farmer would prove different from all the others or if Thunder would send him flying like he had everyone else. Thunder took a single step forward, his hooves raising small puffs of dust that hung in the still air. Ben remained motionless, but William noticed something subtle in the farmer's posture. His shoulders had dropped fractionally, his breathing had deepened, and there was a quality of receptiveness in his stance that seemed to say he was listening with his entire body, not just his ears. It was the strangest thing William had ever seen in a corral, this complete absence of aggressive intent, and yet there was something powerful in it, a different kind of strength that he couldn't quite name. Miguel Torres stood beside William now, his weathered hands gripping the top rail of the fence. The foreman had seen a lot in his 23 years on the Hartley Crown, had witnessed William break horses using methods passed down from his father and grandfather, methods that relied on dominance, on establishing who was boss through a combination of pressure, persistence, and occasionally brute force. Those methods worked, usually, though Miguel had privately come to question the cost, both to the horses and to the men who employed such techniques. Now he watched Ben Matthews with the fascination of someone witnessing something entirely new. "He's not trying to control the horse?" Miguel murmured, more to himself than to William. "He's trying to understand it." William shot him a sharp look. "Understanding doesn't break a wild animal. Strength breaks a wild animal. Will breaks a wild animal. That's how it's always been done." "Maybe," Miguel said quietly, "but maybe that's why Thunder's still unbroken after 2 years." Before William could respond, Ben moved for the first time since entering the corral. It wasn't a move toward Thunder but rather a slow drift to the side, angling away from the stallion at an oblique path that suggested he was going somewhere else entirely, and Thunder just happened to be nearby. The effect was immediate and startling. Thunder's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, relaxed slightly. His tail, which had been switching with agitation, stilled. The horse's entire body language shifted, from defensive aggression to wary curiosity. Ben continued his slow drift, moving in a wide arc that took him along the fence line, and Thunder began to follow, not charging or attacking, but simply tracking this strange human who refused to behave like prey or predator. The farmer maintained the same steady pace, never looking directly at the horse, keeping his body language soft and non-threatening. To William's amazement, Thunder began closing the distance of his own accord, his powerful legs moving with cautious deliberation. Ethan had returned from the barns, drawn back despite his anger by the strange scene unfolding in the corral. He stood on William's other side now, and his voice when he spoke held a note of wonder. "He's making himself interesting without being threatening. Thunder wants to investigate him because he's not acting like the others did." "It's a trick," William said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The horse will turn on him same as he did all the others. Just wait." But Thunder didn't turn. Instead, the stallion continued his cautious approach, drawn by something in Ben's behavior that William couldn't identify. The farmer had completed nearly a full circuit of the corral when he stopped, still not looking directly at Thunder, and simply stood there. The horse stopped as well, perhaps 20 feet away, close enough now that William could see the stallion's nostrils flaring as he tested the air, trying to read this human's scent for signs of danger or deception. Ben reached into his jacket pocket slowly, and several people in the crowd gasped, expecting him to pull out a rope or some tool to try to capture the horse. Instead, he withdrew a small leather pouch and from it produced what looked like a dried root or herb. He held it loosely in his palm, arm extended slightly but not reaching toward Thunder, simply offering. The wind caught the scent and carried it toward the stallion, and Thunder's entire demeanor changed. His ears pricked fully forward, his head lowered, and he took 3 quick steps toward Ben before stopping again, warring between curiosity and caution. "What is that?" Deputy Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the spell. "Looks like OSHA root," said an old-timer in the crowd, a rancher named Herbert who'd worked cattle in these mountains for 50 years. Indians used it for all kinds of things. Horses are drawn to it, helps with their breathing, calms them. My grandfather used to keep some in his pocket when he worked with skittish colts. William felt a surge of irritation. This wasn't horsemanship as he understood it. This was trickery, using some plant to manipulate the horse's instincts rather than meeting its strength with greater strength. And yet he couldn't look away, couldn't deny that something remarkable was happening in his corral, something that made all his previous certainties feel suddenly unstable. Thunder made his decision. The stallion walked forward with deliberate steps, closing the distance until his muzzle hovered inches from Ben's outstretched palm. For a long moment, they held that tableau, man and horse connected by nothing more than breath and possibility. Then Thunder's lips carefully lifted the root from Ben's hand, his whiskers tickling the farmer's skin, and he chewed thoughtfully, his pale eyes never leaving Ben's face. The crowd erupted. Cheers, gasps, and exclamations of disbelief rolled across the corral like a breaking wave. People who'd bet against anyone succeeding began to realize they might lose their money. Others who'd come purely for the spectacle of violence found themselves witnessing something entirely different, something that felt almost sacred in its quiet intimacy. But William heard none of it, his entire attention fixed on the impossible scene before him, his mind racing to categorize, to explain, to somehow fit this into his understanding of how the world worked. Ben still hadn't touched Thunder beyond that brief contact with his palm. He remained still, letting the horse finish the route, waiting with that infinite patience that seemed to be his defining characteristic. When Thunder was done, he didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered his head further, bringing his eyes level with Ben's, and the two regarded each other with an intensity that made William's chest tighten, with something he refused to name as envy. Then Ben did something that made several experienced horsemen in the crowd mutter in surprise. He turned his back on Thunder and walked away. Not quickly, not with fear, but with the same measured pace he'd used before, heading toward the fence as if the stallion no longer interested him. It was a calculated risk, one that could have ended with hooves smashing into his spine, but Ben moved with such calm certainty that it seemed to communicate safety rather than vulnerability. Thunder watched him go, head still lowered, and then did something that made William's mouth go dry. The stallion followed, not charging, not attacking, but following with curious, almost puppyish attention, as if Ben Matthews had become the most interesting thing in his world. The farmer reached the fence and turned, and Thunder stopped just a few feet away, waiting, watching. His entire body language transformed from the aggressive violence he displayed with every other challenger. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Deputy Morrison breathed, his toothpick falling from his lips unnoticed. Ben reached up and carefully lifted his journal from the fence post where he'd left it. He opened it to a page and showed it to Thunder, not as if the horse could read but as if sharing something important. William could see it was a detailed sketch of a horse in a relaxed posture, head low, ears forward, weight balanced evenly. The drawing was remarkably skilled, capturing not just the physical form but something of the animal's essence, its spirit rendered in graphite and ink. "My grandfather drew this," Ben said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, though he seemed to be speaking more to Thunder than to the watching crowd. He said that every horse remembers what it's like to be wild, to be free, to make its own choices. He said the key isn't breaking that memory, it's honoring it. Making a partnership instead of demanding submission. He closed the journal and tucked it back into his jacket, then did something even more remarkable. He walked away from Thunder, heading toward the gate, his time in the corral apparently finished. The crowd began to murmur in confusion. He hadn't ridden the horse. He hadn't even attempted to put a hand on Thunder's back. By the terms of William's wager, he'd accomplished nothing, won nothing, proven nothing except that Thunder could be bribed with herbs to tolerate proximity. William felt relief flood through him, warm and validating. This had been interesting, certainly, but ultimately it changed nothing. Thunder remained unridden. The farmer had made contact but hadn't met the challenge. Everything William believed remained intact, unshaken by this brief, strange interlude. He opened his mouth to declare the day over, his wager still standing, when Thunder did something that would haunt William's dreams for months to come. The stallion followed Ben to the gate. More than that, when Ben stopped to unlatch it, Thunder pressed his muzzle against the farmer's shoulder and left it there. A gesture of trust and connection that every experienced horseman in the crowd recognized instantly. Ben reached up slowly and for the first time placed his hand on Thunder's face, his palm resting against the lightning bolt marking, and the stallion leaned into the touch like a dog seeking affection. The crowd's noise changed quality, wonder replacing skepticism, and William felt the ground shifting beneath his feet in ways he couldn't fully articulate. This wasn't supposed to happen. Thunder was supposed to be untamable, was supposed to prove through his wildness that William's approach, his father's approach, his grandfather's approach was the only way to deal with the harsh realities of animals and land and life itself. But here was evidence of something different, something that made William's entire philosophy feel suddenly brittle and incomplete. Ben stepped through the gate and closed it behind him, leaving Thunder on the other side. The stallion didn't rear or rage as he had when others had failed and retreated. Instead, he stood at the fence, head over the top rail, watching Ben with those pale eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any horse should possess. The farmer walked over to where William stood, and up close, the rancher could see the deep lines around Ben's eyes, the silver in his stubble, the wear of a hard life written in every detail of his face. "Your horse isn't broken," Ben said quietly. His voice pitched for William alone, though the nearest spectators could certainly hear. "He's traumatized. Something happened to him, probably when he was caught in the priors, something that taught him humans mean pain and fear. Every rider you sent in there today confirmed that lesson. Force met with force, aggression answered with aggression. You're not trying to break a wild horse, Mr. Hartley. You're trying to break a terrified one, and there's a world of difference between those two things." William's face flushed hot with anger and something deeper, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. "I've broken dozens of horses in my life. Hundreds, counting the ones I watched my father and grandfather work. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. You show them you're stronger, you show them resistance is futile, and eventually they accept it and become useful." "Useful," Ben repeated, and the word hung in the air between them, weighted with judgment. "Is that what you wanted? Just another useful animal in your stable? Because that stallion has the potential to be so much more than useful. He could be a partner. He could be magnificent. But not if you keep trying to crush the spirit out of him." "I don't need a philosophy lesson from a dirt farmer," William snapped, his voice louder than he intended, drawing startled looks from nearby spectators. "You made contact with him, congratulations, but you didn't ride him. You didn't meet the challenge. So take your New Age nonsense and your grandfather's Indian tricks and get off my property before I have Deputy Morrison remove you for trespassing." Ben held his gaze for a long moment, and William saw pity in those brown eyes, which stung worse than contempt would have. Then the farmer nodded once. "Your property, your rules. But that horse deserves better than what you're giving him, and deep down I think you know it." He turned and walked toward his battered truck, the crowd parting to let him through. Some people reached out to pat his shoulder or murmur words of encouragement. Others stared at William with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The rancher felt the weight of their judgment, felt the story already forming. How William Hartley's pride had been challenged by a humble farmer who'd shown more wisdom in 15 minutes than the wealthy rancher had in a lifetime. Ethan approached, his face tight with controlled emotion. "Dad, you just made a mistake. That man showed you something important, something that could change how we work with horses here, and you threw it back in his face because of your pride." "My pride built this ranch," William shot back. "My pride kept us going through droughts and recessions and cattle diseases that killed off half the herds in this valley. Don't lecture me about pride when you've never had to carry the weight I carry." "Mom carried that weight with you?" Ethan said, his voice dropping to something sad and weary. "And she did it with grace and kindness. You're carrying it alone now, and it's making you mean. Can't you see that?" Before William could respond, Miguel Torres called out urgently from near the corral. "Boss, you need to see this." William strode over, grateful for the interruption, and looked where Miguel pointed. Thunder had moved to his water trough, the one that had been empty all day, and was staring at it pointedly before looking toward the humans gathered at the fence. The message was unmistakable. The horse was thirsty and was actually asking for help rather than attacking anyone who tried to provide it. "He's been gentled," Miguel said softly. "That farmer did in 15 minutes what we couldn't do in 2 years. He made Thunder trust just a little, just enough." William stared at the stallion, at the way Thunder's ears were still forward rather than pinned, at the absence of the coiled violence that had characterized his every movement before Ben Matthews had entered the corral. Something had changed, undeniably, and William found himself facing a choice that terrified him more than any wild horse ever had. He could acknowledge what had happened here, could admit that his approach had been wrong or at least incomplete, could open himself to the possibility that there were better ways to accomplish what he wanted. Or he could dig in, could insist that Ben's success was temporary or illusory, could maintain the beliefs that had sustained him through his wife's death and the long empty years since. The choice seemed to be between evolution and extinction, between growth and calcification. But William Hartley had spent 67 years learning to be hard, learning to dominate, learning that the only way to survive in this harsh land was to be harsher still. Changing now felt like betraying everything he was, everything 3 generations of Hartleys had built. So he made his choice, the only choice his pride would allow. "Get that trough filled," he told Miguel. "And tomorrow we start fresh. I'll find riders who actually know what they're doing, not cowboys and drifters. Thunder's going to be broken proper, the way my grandfather would have done it, and this whole circus will be forgotten." Miguel's face fell, disappointment, clear in his expression, but he nodded and moved to follow orders. Ethan stared at his father with something that looked like grief before turning away and heading toward the house. The crowd began to disperse, the show apparently over for the day, though William could hear the excited chatter, the retelling of what they'd witnessed, the story already transforming into legend. Deputy Morrison lingered, his face unreadable. "William, I've known you a long time, long enough to say this plain. You're making a mistake. That farmer showed you a better way, and you're spitting on it because accepting it would mean admitting you were wrong. That's not strength. That's just stubbornness wearing strength's clothes." "Are you finished, Frank?" The deputy studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Yeah, I'm finished. But this isn't over. That horse is going to break someone bad if you keep it this, and when he does, the blood will be on your hands." He walked away, leaving William standing alone at the fence as the sun touched the peaks of the Absaroka Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if William had been capable of seeing beauty in that moment. Instead, he stared at Thunder, at the gray stallion who stood calmly now at his water trough, drinking deeply from the bucket Miguel had filled, and felt the first cold whisper of genuine fear creep into his certainty. Not fear of the horse, but fear of what it might mean if the farmer had been right and William's entire life had been built on a foundation of cruelty disguised as strength. That fear was too large to face directly, so he buried it under anger, under determination, under the familiar armor of pride that had never failed him before. Behind him, the ranch settled into evening routines, but something had changed in the air, some subtle shift that everyone felt but no one could quite name. The story of what happened today would spread through Paradise Valley like ripples from a stone thrown in still water, reaching places and people William couldn't control, shaping perceptions and opinions in ways he couldn't predict. And in his battered truck heading back toward town, Ben Matthews drove slowly through the gathering dusk, his journal open on the passenger seat to a page he'd written years ago, words his grandfather had spoken on his deathbed. The strongest man isn't the one who can dominate everything around him. The strongest man is the one who knows when to stop dominating and start listening. Ben had tried to share that wisdom, had offered it freely to a man drowning in his own pride. Whether William would accept it or not wasn't something Ben could control. He'd planted a seed. What grew from it, or whether anything grew at all, was up to William Hartley and the choices he'd make in the days to come. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and darkness fell across Paradise Valley, like a curtain dropping on the first act of a drama, whose ending no one could yet foresee. Dawn broke cold over Paradise Valley, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds, each blade rimmed with ice that would melt by mid-morning, but for now transformed the ranch into something crystalline and strange. William Hartley had barely slept, his mind churning through the events of the previous day, replaying Ben Matthews's quiet challenge and the way thunder had responded to the farmer's approach. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment when the stallion had pressed his muzzle to Ben's shoulder, a gesture of trust that William had never managed to earn despite owning the horse for 2 years. He stood now in his kitchen, a massive room with copper pots hanging from ceiling beams and windows that looked out over the eastern pastures toward the mountains. The coffee in his hand had gone cold while he stared at nothing, wrestling with thoughts he couldn't quite bring into focus. Margaret's presence lingered in this room more than anywhere else in the house. She'd spent countless mornings here, making breakfast for ranch hands, baking bread that filled the whole place with warmth and the yeasty smell of rising dough. After she died, William had hired a cook, but the woman came and went on a schedule, and the kitchen between her shifts felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of food. Miguel found him there, the foreman letting himself in through the back door as he'd done 1,000 times before. He carried the weight of bad news in his posture, shoulders tight, face carefully neutral in the way of men who've learned to deliver unwelcome information to powerful people who don't like hearing it. "Boss, we got a situation," Miguel said, pouring himself coffee from the pot without asking. That small familiar gesture somehow made whatever was coming easier to hear. 3 of the hands quit this morning, just packed their gear and drove off without even collecting their final pay. William turned from the window, his face hardening into the mask he wore when the world disappointed him. "Which 3? Tommy, David, and young Jesse. They left a note saying they didn't want to be part of what's happening here anymore. That watching thunder get provoked all day yesterday made them sick. They said if you're going to keep at it, they want no part of it." "Then they were weak," William said flatly. "This ranch has no place for weakness. We'll find replacements." Miguel set his coffee down with more force than necessary, the cup clacking against the granite counter. "Boss, with respect, those weren't weak men. Tommy worked here 8 years, never missed a day, never complained even when we were branding cattle in 100-degree heat. David saved 2 calves during that blizzard 3 years back, nearly lost his fingers to frostbite doing it. And Jesse, that kid worked harder than men twice his age. They didn't leave because they're weak. They left because they're decent." The implication hung in the air between them, and William felt his temper spike hot and defensive. "Are you saying I'm not decent, Miguel? After 23 years, is that what you think of me?" The foreman met his gaze steadily, and William saw something in those dark eyes he'd never seen before, disappointment bordering on contempt. "I'm saying you're not the man I started working for." William Hartley used to care about more than just winning. He used to care about doing things right. That man died when Miss Margaret did, and I'm not sure who you are now, but I know I don't much like him. For a moment, William considered firing Miguel on the spot, telling him to pack his things and get off the property within the hour. The words formed in his throat, hot and harsh, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the 23 years of loyalty, or maybe it was the uncomfortable recognition that Miguel was saying out loud what William had been avoiding thinking. Either way, he swallowed the words and turned back to the window. "I've got more. Riders coming today," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "Real professionals, not the amateurs and drifters we saw yesterday. Thunder will be broken by sunset, and this whole mess will be finished." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that cut deeper than anger could have. "That farmer showed you something yesterday, boss. He showed all of us something. But you're going to ignore it because admitting he was right means admitting you've been wrong. And I guess that's too much for your pride to handle." He left without another word, the back door closing with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than if he'd slammed it. William stood alone in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of Margaret's bread, though she'd been gone 4 years, and felt the walls of his certainty beginning to develop cracks he couldn't quite seal. By 9 in the morning, the crowds had returned to the Hartley Crown, even larger than the day before. Word of what had happened with Ben Matthews had spread through the valley and beyond, carried by social media posts and text messages and the simple human hunger for story. The live stream from yesterday had been viewed over 50,000 times, and now there were multiple people with cameras and phones set up around the corral, ready to broadcast whatever happened next to an audience that had grown from local curiosity to regional fascination. William hated it, hated being watched and judged by strangers, hated that his private business had become public spectacle. But he also recognized that he'd created this situation himself with his $2 million wager, and now he had to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited. His pride wouldn't allow retreat, wouldn't permit him to simply call the whole thing off and admit that maybe his approach had been flawed from the start. The first professional rider arrived at 10, a man named Marcus Webb who'd won championships in Calgary and Cheyenne, whose name appeared on promotional posters for major rodeo events, whose reputation for riding unrideable horses had earned him 6-figure endorsement deals. He pulled up in a massive truck towing a trailer that probably cost more than most people's houses, and he emerged wearing designer jeans, custom boots, and a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate that caught the morning sun and threw back light like a mirror. Marcus was 45 but looked younger, with the kind of maintained appearance that came from money and vanity in equal measure. His hair was too perfectly styled for a working cowboy, his teeth were too white, and his handshake when he met William was too firm, the grip of a man who'd learned that dominance started with first impressions. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, and William could see the intelligence there, the understanding of physics and balance and the split-second timing that separated champions from corpses. "Mr. Hartley," Marcus said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who'd grown up in Texas but had spent enough time in different places to smooth out the rough edges. "I watched the videos from yesterday. That farmer's trick with the root was cute, real cute, but it doesn't mean anything. The horse still hasn't been ridden, still hasn't learned who's boss. That's where I come in." William nodded, wanting to believe this polished professional would succeed where others had failed, would validate everything William had built his life believing. "You understand the terms? 60 seconds on his back, and you walk away with 2 million. Marcus grinned, confidence radiating from him like heat from pavement. "I understand the terms, but let's be real. I'm not here for the money. I'm here because riding Thunder will make me a legend. Every cowboy in 5 states has heard about this horse, and when I break him, my reputation goes through the roof. The money's just a bonus." He strode toward the corral with the swagger of someone who'd never encountered a problem his talent and determination couldn't solve. The crowd pressed close, sensing that this might be different from yesterday's attempts, that this professional with his championships and endorsements might actually succeed. Thunder stood at the far end of the corral, and William noticed immediately that the stallion's demeanor had changed since Ben's visit. The horse still radiated power and wildness, but there was a watchfulness in his posture now, a quality of attention rather than blind aggression. Marcus vaulted over the fence with athletic ease and landed in the red dirt, his boots sending up small puffs of dust. He didn't approach Thunder directly, but instead began a series of movements clearly designed to establish dominance, making himself large, moving aggressively through the space, claiming the corral as his territory. It was textbook horse-breaking technique, the kind taught in manuals and passed down through generations of professional trainers. It should have worked. Thunder's ears pinned flat against his skull, And William saw the stallion's entire body language shift from watchful to actively hostile. The horse remembered yesterday's parade of challengers, remembered the aggression and pain and fear they'd brought. And now here was another one, even more confident, even more determined to impose his will. The stallion's pale eyes seemed to narrow, focusing on Marcus with an intensity that made several people in the crowd step back from the fence. Marcus produced a rope from his belt, a lasso made of braided leather that probably cost a month's wages for an ordinary ranch hand. He began to swing it in a wide circle, the rope whistling through the air, a show of skill designed to intimidate the horse before the actual confrontation began. It was unnecessary, pure showmanship for the cameras and the crowd, and William felt a flicker of doubt. This wasn't about breaking a horse anymore. This was about ego and reputation and spectacle, and Thunder, with whatever intelligence lived behind those ghostly eyes, seemed to understand the difference. The rope flew toward Thunder, aiming to settle around his neck, and the stallion moved with a speed that didn't seem possible for something his size. He pivoted, the rope passing through empty air, and charged directly at Marcus with murder in every line of his body. The professional rider scrambled backward, his confidence evaporating in the face of 1,500 pounds of fury bearing down on him. He made it to the fence and vaulted over with seconds to spare, Thunder's teeth snapping shut on air where Marcus's leg had been a moment before. The crowd gasped and then erupted in nervous chatter. Marcus landed hard on the other side of the fence, his perfect hair disheveled, dust covering his designer clothes, and his face flushed with humiliation and anger. He turned on William, jabbing a finger toward the rancher. "That animal is psychotic," Marcus snapped. "There's something wrong with him, something broken in his brain. No normal horse acts like that. You want him broken, you're going to need a veterinarian and a syringe full of sedatives because no rider, no matter how good, is going to stay on something that insane." William felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar surge of defensive anger, but underneath it was something else, the uncomfortable whisper that maybe Marcus was right, not about Thunder being psychotic but about there being something broken, and maybe that broken thing wasn't in the horse. But admitting that would mean admitting everything, would mean acknowledging that his entire approach to animals and land and life itself had been fundamentally flawed, and that admission felt like death. "I'll find someone else," William said, his voice flat and hard. "Someone with more courage than you apparently have." Marcus's eyes flashed dangerously. "Courage? I've ridden bulls that killed 3 men before I climbed on. I've been thrown into fences, trampled, kicked hard enough to break ribs and puncture a lung. Don't talk to me about courage. That horse isn't a challenge, it's a death wish, and I'm not stupid enough to grant it." He stalked back to his expensive truck, and William watched him go, feeling the eyes of the crowd weighing on him, judging him, finding him wanting. Deputy Morrison appeared at his elbow, his face grave with concern. "William, this needs to stop. You've had 8 riders try now, and everyone has failed or refused. At some point, you need to accept that maybe this isn't about finding the right rider. Maybe it's about finding the right approach, and that farmer yesterday showed you what that approach looks like. Ben Matthews showed me that you can bribe a horse with herbs and get close enough to touch him." William shot back. "That's not the same as breaking him, not the same as making him useful and rideable. Any fool can feed treats to a wild animal. That doesn't make you a horseman." Frank Morrison's expression hardened, and he spoke with the authority of his badge, rather than the friendship they'd shared for decades. "I'm officially advising you to end this. You're creating a dangerous situation, and if someone gets seriously hurt or killed, you will be held liable. Your property, your horse, your responsibility. And you won't like how that plays out in court." He walked away before William could respond, leaving the rancher standing alone while the crowd milled around, uncertain whether to stay and wait for the next attempt or to leave and spread stories about William Hartley's folly. Ethan emerged from the barn leading a saddled horse, clearly planning to ride out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. But he stopped when he saw his father's face. "More failures?" Ethan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus Webb refused to try after Thunder charged him, called the horse psychotic, said no one could ride him without drugging him first. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful precision, choosing words the way a man crosses a frozen river, testing each step before committing his weight. Dad, what if he's right? Not about Thunder being psychotic, but about the approach being wrong. That farmer yesterday did something in 15 minutes that we couldn't do in 2 years. Doesn't that tell you something? It tells me that people are too quick to embrace easy answers, William said. Everyone wants to believe there's a gentle way to do everything, wants to pretend that harsh realities don't exist and firm methods aren't sometimes necessary. But that's fantasy, son. This is a hard world, and surviving in it requires being harder than what tries to break you. Is it? Or is that just what Grandpa taught you, and what his father taught him, and so on back through generations of Hartley men who confused cruelty with strength? Ethan's voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through his usual careful control. Mom knew the difference. She was the strongest person I ever knew, and she never had to dominate or break anything to prove it. The mention of Margaret sent a spike of pain through William's chest, sharp and hot. Your mother had the luxury of being soft because I was hard enough for both of us. Someone has to make the difficult decisions, has to do what needs doing even when it's ugly. That's what being a man means in this country. No, Dad, that's what being afraid means. You're terrified of being vulnerable, terrified of admitting you might be wrong, so you double down on methods that clearly aren't working and call it strength. But everyone can see what it really is, and they're losing respect for you because of it. Ethan swung up into his saddle and rode away before William could respond, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance. William stood in the cold morning air, surrounded by hundreds of strangers who'd come to watch his pride be tested, and felt more alone than he had since the night Margaret died. The second professional arrived just before noon, a woman named Alexandra Pierce who'd made her reputation breaking wild Mustangs for the Bureau of Land Management. She was in her 50s, lean and weathered, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every kind of horse behavior and knew how to read the subtle signals most people missed. Unlike Marcus, she carried no swagger, no false confidence. She walked with the efficient economy of movement common to people who'd spent their lives working with dangerous animals. William met her at the corral, hope flickering despite his better judgment. If anyone could succeed, surely it would be someone with Alexandra's experience and no-nonsense approach. She studied Thunder for a long time before speaking, walking the perimeter of the corral, observing the horse from different angles, noting details that William couldn't identify. Finally, she turned to him, and her face held something that looked like pity. Mr. Hartley, that horse has been traumatized. I don't know what happened to him before you bought him, but I can see it in every line of his body, in the way he holds tension in his hindquarters, in how his ears never fully relax, in the hypervigilance that never stops. Someone hurt him badly, probably multiple someones, and every person you send into that corral confirms his belief that humans are threats to be defended against. So you're refusing to try? William asked, hearing the defeat in his own voice. I'm saying that breaking him the traditional way will either kill him or destroy whatever made him magnificent in the first place. You'll end up with a shell, a hollow thing that obeys out of fear rather than respect. Is that what you want? I want a rideable horse, William said stubbornly. I want what I paid for. Alexandra shook her head slowly. You paid for a wild stallion. That's what you got. What you're asking for now is something different, something that requires an approach you're apparently unwilling to consider. That farmer yesterday showed you the path forward, but you're too proud to take it. She left without attempting to enter the corral, driving away in her sensible truck while the crowd murmured and shifted, the narrative of the day solidifying into something William couldn't control. William Hartley, the wealthy rancher who thought money and force could solve any problem, being defeated by his own stubbornness. That was the story being written in real time, being broadcast to tens of thousands of viewers, being locked into the collective memory of Paradise Valley in ways William would never be able to erase. Miguel returned as the afternoon sun began its slide toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the corral where Thunder stood, still unridden, still untamed by any traditional measure. The foreman carried a tablet, which was unusual enough that William knew something significant was coming. Boss, you need to see this, Miguel said, pulling up a video on the screen. It was footage from last night, captured by security cameras William had installed around the ranch after some equipment had gone missing 3 years ago. The timestamp showed 2 in the morning, the world reduced to the grainy green of night vision. In the footage, a figure approached the corral. It took William a moment to recognize Ben Matthews, the farmer who'd left hours earlier. Ben climbed the fence slowly and dropped into the corral with Thunder, and William's breath caught, expecting violence. But Thunder didn't charge. Instead, the stallion walked directly to Ben, and the two stood together in the darkness, the farmer's hand resting on the horse's neck, his forehead pressed against Thunder's face in a gesture of intimacy that made William's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. They stayed that way for several minutes, man and horse sharing some silent communion, before Ben climbed back out and disappeared into the night. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but in that brief window, William saw more connection, more genuine relationship than he'd managed to build in 2 years of ownership. "He came back," Miguel said quietly. "After you threw him off your property, after you insulted his methods, he came back to check on Thunder. Not because he wanted your money or your approval, because he cared about the horse." William stared at the frozen image on the screen, Ben's hand on Thunder's neck, and felt something crack inside him, some long-held certainty finally giving way under accumulated pressure. For 2 years, he'd told himself he owned this horse, that ownership meant control, that control was achieved through dominance. But watching this midnight encounter, he understood with sudden painful clarity that ownership and relationship were not the same thing, that Ben Matthews had built more connection in a handful of encounters than William had managed despite holding Thunder's papers and paying for his feed. The sun touched the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow, and William Hartley stood surrounded by the ruins of his pride, finally beginning to understand that everything he believed about strength and control and what it meant to master the harsh realities of life might have been not just wrong but backwards, that true strength might look more like Ben Matthews's patient midnight vigil than all of William's loud public demonstrations of force. But understanding and accepting were different things, and the gap between them was filled with a lifetime of habits and beliefs that wouldn't surrender easily. The day ended with Thunder still unbroken, William's wager still unclaimed, and a growing sense throughout Paradise Valley that they were witnessing not the breaking of a horse but the breaking of a man, and no one was quite sure which outcome would be more tragic. The third day dawned with clouds pressing low against the mountains, heavy and gray with the promise of snow that Montana weather could deliver even in late September. The air tasted metallic and cold, and the cattle in the distant pastures huddled together against the coming storm. William had spent another sleepless night, this time not wrestling with pride but with the security footage Miguel had shown him, that image of Ben Matthews returning in darkness to offer comfort to a traumatized horse, asking nothing in return, expecting no recognition or reward. By 7 in the morning, word had spread that William was ending the wager. The announcement came not through any formal statement but through whispers among the ranch hands, through Miguel quietly telling people who called that there would be no more attempts today, through a subtle shift in the energy of the Hartley crown that everyone could feel but few could articulate. The crowds that had gathered for 2 days stayed home, and the corral stood empty except for Thunder, who moved restlessly as the barometric pressure dropped and his instincts warned of the approaching storm. William stood on his porch with coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the gray stallion pace the fence line. The horse's agitation was visible even from this distance, his tail switching, his head tossing, his powerful body coiled with tension that had nowhere to go. In 2 years of ownership, William had never considered what Thunder experienced, what thoughts moved through that animal brain, what fears or hopes or memories shaped his behavior. The horse had been a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome, a possession to be controlled, not a being with his own internal life, his own history of pain and survival. Ethan appeared beside him without announcement, holding his own coffee, standing in the companionable silence they used to share before Margaret's death had driven a wedge between them. Father and son watched Thunder together, and finally Ethan spoke, his voice soft enough that the words felt like offerings rather than accusations. "When I was 8, Mom found a dog by the side of the road. Someone had beaten it so badly it couldn't walk, just lay there in the ditch waiting to die. She brought it home and you wanted to put it down, said it was too damaged, too expensive to fix. that putting it out of its misery was the kindest thing. But she refused. She sat with that dog every night for 3 weeks, hand-feeding it, talking to it, letting it heal on its own schedule. William remembered. The dog had been a mongrel, ugly and broken, and he'd been convinced Margaret was wasting time and money on something that would never be whole again. He said nothing, letting Ethan continue. That dog lived another 6 years. Became the gentlest animal I've ever known. Never aggressive, never mean, even though it had every reason to be. And you know what Mom told me when I asked how she did it? She said that healing only happens when something feels safe, and feeling safe means knowing you won't be hurt for being vulnerable. She said the same thing was true for horses, for people, for everything that breathes. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. William wanted to argue, wanted to say that animals and people were different, that a rancher couldn't afford to coddle every creature that needed healing. But the arguments felt hollow even as he formed them, defenses against a truth he was no longer sure he could avoid. "I don't know how to be that," William said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been grief or might have been the first stirrings of change. "Your mother, she had that gentleness in her from the start. I learned everything from my father, and he learned from his father, and their way was hard because this land is hard. I don't know another way." "You could learn," Ethan said. "That farmer could teach you if you'd let him. If you could get past your pride long enough to admit you need teaching." Thunder suddenly reared at the fence, his front hooves striking the top rail hard enough to crack the wood. The sound echoed across the ranch like a gunshot, and William felt it resonate in his chest. The storm was closer now, the wind picking up, carrying the first stinging drops of freezing rain that presaged the snow to come. Thunder's agitation intensified, his movements becoming more frantic, and William realized with sudden clarity that the horse was terrified. Not of people now, but of the coming storm, of being trapped in the corral with no shelter and no way to escape the elements. "He's going to hurt himself," Ethan said, setting down his coffee and moving toward the steps. "We need to get him into the barn before the storm hits full force." But Thunder had already proven that no one could approach him safely, that any human presence triggered his trauma and sent him into defensive violence. William stood paralyzed by the problem, his old solutions inadequate, his pride preventing him from seeing new possibilities. Then Ethan did something that would haunt William's memory for the rest of his life. His son pulled out his phone and made a call. "Mr. Matthews? This is Ethan Hartley, William's son. We need your help. There's a storm coming and Thunder's going to hurt himself. Can you come?" William wanted to stop him, wanted to grab the phone and end the call, wanted to maintain his independence and solve his own problems the way Hartley men always had. But he didn't move. He stood frozen while his son arranged for the farmer to return, while his pride and his fear warred with the growing understanding that sometimes strength meant admitting weakness, sometimes winning meant surrendering. Ben Matthews arrived within 30 minutes, his old truck laboring up the ranch road through rain that was already turning to sleet. He climbed out wearing the same worn jacket, carrying the same leather journal, his face showing no triumph or satisfaction at being called back, only concern for a horse in distress. He nodded to Ethan, nodded to William, and walked directly to the corral where Thunder had begun throwing himself against the fence with enough force to shake the entire structure. "He's storm-phobic," Ben said, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Something bad happened to him during a storm, probably when he was caught in the priors. The thunder and lightning, the feeling of being trapped, it all comes back and he panics. We need to get him somewhere he feels safe before he breaks a leg or his neck." "The barn," William said, his voice strained. "But he won't let anyone near him to lead him there." Ben nodded, already moving toward the gate. "I'm not going to lead him. I'm going to ask him to follow, and then we're going to trust that he remembers from last night that I'm not a threat." He entered the corral, and Thunder wheeled to face him, eyes rolling white with panic, foam flecking his lips. The stallion reared, screaming his fear and fury into the wind, and Ben stood still, waiting, his body language communicating patience and calm even as the storm intensified around them. Rain soaked through Ben's jacket, plastered his hair to his skull, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited for Thunder to see him. really see him, past the fear and trauma. The moment came like a shift in the weather itself, sudden and complete. Thunder's front hooves hit the ground, and his ears flicked forward, recognizing the human who'd visited him in darkness, who'd asked nothing and offered comfort. Ben took a single step toward the barn, not looking at Thunder, not reaching for him, just moving with clear intent. Thunder hesitated, then followed. One step, then another, drawn by something stronger than his fear, some nascent trust that had taken root during those midnight minutes when Ben had simply stood with him in the dark. They moved across the corral together, man and horse, while William and Ethan and Miguel watched in silence that felt sacred. The barn door stood open, and Ben walked through it into the dimness within. Thunder stopped at the threshold, his instincts warring with his panic. The barn represented confinement, represented the loss of options that prey animals fear more than almost anything. But Ben stood inside, visible in the shadows, and his presence tipped the balance. Thunder entered the barn. Ben led him to a box stall, large and airy with deep straw bedding and windows that let in light even during the storm. Thunder circled the space once, testing it, then seemed to decide it was acceptable. He moved to the far corner and stood there, sides heaving, but the frantic edge of his panic had dulled. Ben backed out of the stall slowly and closed the door, latching it securely but not before placing a bucket of water within Thunder's reach. The farmer emerged from the barn soaked and shivering, and Ethan immediately offered him a towel and a jacket. The three men stood in the shelter of the barn entrance while the storm unleashed itself fully now, snow mixing with rain to create a horizontal assault that turned the world white and gray. Thunder was safe. The crisis had passed, and William felt something inside him finally break open, some calcified shell that had formed around his heart after Margaret died, cracking under the accumulated pressure of failure and revelation. "How did you do that?" William asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "How did you reach him when no one else could?" Ben dried his face with the towel, considering his answer carefully before speaking. "I didn't reach him through dominance or tricks. I reached him because I saw him, not as a problem or a challenge or a possession, but as a living thing with his own experiences and fears. My grandfather taught me that every animal carries its history in its body, and trauma lives in the muscles and the memory. You can't beat trauma out of something. You can only offer safety consistent enough and long enough that the trauma begins to heal. Your grandfather was with the Crow Nation," William said, remembering. He learned their ways with horses, ways that go back centuries before white people came to this land. Not breaking, not dominating, but partnering. Making a relationship based on mutual respect rather than forced submission. The slower, takes more patience, but what you build lasts because it's built on trust instead of fear. The words cut through William's defenses because they came without judgment, without the satisfaction of being proven right. Ben Matthews had returned not to gloat but to help. Had risked himself in the storm not for money or recognition but because a horse needed him. That simple fact, that uncomplicated decency, illuminated the vast distance between the man William had been and the man he'd once hoped to become. "I spent 2 years trying to break him," William said, the admission costing him more than he'd imagined possible. 2 years using every method my father taught me, every technique I learned growing up. And in 2 days you've done what I couldn't do. Made him trust, made him follow, made him believe that a human could be safe. Ben was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful gentleness. "Mr. Hartley, may I tell you something true? This isn't about you failing. This is about methods that don't work being taught as if they do. Your father taught you what his father taught him going back generations. But wrong stays wrong no matter how long it's been practiced. You're not a bad man for using the tools you were given. But you could be a better man by choosing different tools now that you see there are better ones available." The storm raged outside, shaking the barn walls, but inside there was warmth from the animals and the hay and the presence of 3 men beginning to understand each other. William looked at his son, saw hope in Ethan's eyes, hope that maybe they could find their way back to each other, hope that the Hartley legacy didn't have to be one of hardness and domination passed down like a curse. "Will you teach me?" William asked, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff, like surrendering everything he'd used to define himself. Will you show me your grandfather's way? I'll pay you whatever you want, give you whatever you need, just teach me how to reach thunder the way you did. Ben smiled, a small sad expression that held more compassion than William felt he deserved. I don't want your money, Mr. Hartley. I lost my farm last year to drought, lost everything I'd built. I came here because I heard about a horse in trouble, not because I wanted to prove you wrong or make you look foolish. If you're truly ready to learn, I'll teach you gladly. But first you need to understand that this isn't a transaction. This is a transformation. What I'm offering will change not just how you work with horses but how you see the world. Are you ready for that? William thought of Margaret, of the dog she'd healed with patience, of the countless small moments when she tried to gentle him the way she gentled broken things. He thought of Ethan's disappointment, of the ranch hands who'd quit rather than participate in Thunder's torment, of Deputy Morrison's warning that he was losing himself to pride. He thought of 2 years wasted trying to force Thunder into submission, 2 years that had taught the horse nothing except that humans meant pain. I'm ready, he said, and meant it with a desperation that felt like drowning and salvation all at once. The storm continued through the afternoon and into evening, dumping 6 inches of heavy wet snow that would melt within days but for now transformed the ranch into a monochrome landscape. Ben stayed, invited into the main house, given dry clothes that had belonged to William and fit him poorly but served their purpose. The 3 men sat in the great room where a fire crackled in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, drinking coffee that Ethan had made strong enough to strip paint. Ben opened his journal and began to explain, not lecturing but sharing, turning each page to show sketches and notes accumulated over years of practice. He talked about reading body language, about understanding that a horse's ear position communicated volumes, about recognizing the difference between aggression and fear-based defense. He explained his grandfather's philosophy that every animal was a teacher if you knew how to listen, that the goal wasn't to impose your will but to invite partnership. Thunder's trauma shows in specific ways, Ben said, pointing to sketches that could have been drawn from the gray stallion himself. He holds tension here in his hindquarters, keeps his weight shifted back ready to flee. His ears never fully relax because he's in a constant state of hypervigilance. When someone approaches with dominant energy, it confirms his belief that humans are predators, and he responds accordingly. But when you approach with what my grandfather called receptive energy, you're telling him that you're not a threat, that you're willing to exist in his space without demanding he change anything about himself. How do you create receptive energy? Ethan asked, leaning forward, completely absorbed in a way William had never seen him engaged with ranching before. It starts with your breath, Ben said. Most people hold their breath when they're nervous or trying to control something, but horses read breath like we read facial expressions. Deep, slow breathing tells them you're calm, that you're safe to be around. Then there's your posture. You make yourself smaller, not threatening. You approach at angles rather than head-on. You give them choices rather than forcing outcomes. Every interaction becomes a conversation rather than a demand. William listened, and with each explanation, each sketch, each story from Ben's grandfather, he felt the architecture of his understanding shift and reform. Everything he'd believed about strength and control wasn't wrong exactly, but it was incomplete, like knowing only half the alphabet and trying to write poetry with it. What Ben described required a different kind of strength, the strength to be patient when instinct screamed for action, the strength to be vulnerable when pride demanded walls, the strength to admit ignorance and accept teaching. When can we start? William asked as the fire burned low and the storm outside began to quiet. When can you begin working with thunder? Ben closed his journal and looked at William with those clear brown eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the frightened man beneath. We already started, Mr. Hartley. The work began the moment you admitted you needed help. But understand that working with thunder means working with yourself first. The horse will mirror whatever energy you bring him. If you approach carrying anger or frustration or the need to prove something, he'll respond with defense and aggression. You need to resolve what's inside you before you can help him resolve what's inside him. The words hit harder than William expected, and he felt moisture prick his eyes. the first tears he'd allowed since Margaret's funeral. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to resolve 4 years of grief and anger and feeling like I failed her by not being able to save her." Ethan's hand found his father's shoulder, squeezing gently, and the contact broke something loose. William wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears of men who've learned to ration their emotions, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone finally admitting how deeply wounded they were. He wept for Margaret, for the softness she tried to teach him that he'd rejected after her death. He wept for Thunder and the 2 years of trauma he'd inflicted trying to break something already broken. He wept for Ethan and the distance his grief had created between them. He wept for himself and the man he'd become in trying to armor himself against pain. Ben and Ethan sat with him through it, not offering empty comfort or trying to stop the tears, just being present the way Ben had been present for Thunder, asking nothing, simply witnessing. When the storm finally passed, both the one outside and the one William had been carrying, the world felt different, cleaner, like the air after lightning has passed through it. Over the following days, Ben began the real work. He moved into one of the guest cabins on the ranch, refusing payment but accepting room and board. Each morning, he went to Thunder's stall and simply stood there, not trying to touch the horse, not demanding anything, just being present. He'd open his journal and sketch, or he'd play a wooden flute he'd carved himself, or he'd just breathe and wait. And gradually, incrementally, Thunder began to relax in his presence. William watched from a distance at first, learning by observation. He saw how Ben never forced interaction, never punished wariness, never took Thunder's fear personally. When the horse approached of his own accord, Ben rewarded it with calm acknowledgement. When Thunder retreated, Ben let him go without judgment. It was the opposite of everything William had been taught, and yet it worked with an effectiveness that traditional methods had never achieved. After a week, Ben invited William into the barn during one of his sessions. "Don't try to touch him yet," Ben instructed. "Just stand with me, breathe slowly, make yourself peaceful inside, and let that peace extend outward. Thunder will feel it before he sees it." William tried, found it harder than any physical labor he'd ever performed. His mind raced with thoughts and judgments and the instinct to do something, to act, to force progress. But Ben's presence beside him was like an anchor, steadying him, and gradually William felt his breathing deepen, felt his shoulders drop, felt something in his chest unclench. Thunder, who'd been watching them warily from the far corner of his stall, took a step closer. "Good," Ben murmured. "Stay exactly like that. You're not trying to reach him. You're just sharing space. Let him decide what happens next." They stood together for 30 minutes, and Thunder edged closer inch by inch, drawn by something he sensed but couldn't quite identify. Finally, the gray stallion stood close enough that William could have reached out and touched him. The temptation was overwhelming, the need to make contact, to prove progress, to control the moment. But Ben's lessons held him back, and William simply stood there, breathing, being, waiting. Thunder stretched his neck out and sniffed William's shoulder, his breath hot and alive. Then the stallion did something that made William's throat tighten. Thunder pressed his muzzle against William's chest, right over his heart, and stood there as if listening to its rhythm. The gesture was so trusting, so vulnerable, that William felt tears start again. This magnificent creature who'd been traumatized and terrified was offering connection, was choosing to trust despite every reason not to. "You can touch him now," Ben said softly. "Slowly. Let your hand follow your breath." William raised his hand with aching slowness and placed it on Thunder's neck. The stallion tensed but didn't flee. William kept his hand still, not stroking or petting, just resting there, feeling the warmth of the horse's body, the life pulsing beneath the dappled gray coat. They stood that way for a long time, man and horse, beginning to understand each other not through dominance but through the simple, profound act of mutual presence. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of William's life. Ben's teaching extended beyond horsemanship into something closer to philosophy, a complete reorientation of how William related to the world. They worked with Thunder daily, building trust one small interaction at a time. The horse began to follow William the way he followed Ben, began to show signs of curiosity rather than fear, began to heal in ways that became visible to everyone on the ranch. Word spread through Paradise Valley about the transformation happening at the Hartley Crown. The crowds that had come to watch thunder be broken now heard stories of something different, of healing and partnership, of a wealthy rancher humbling himself to learn from a farmer who'd lost everything. The narrative shifted, and with it, William's reputation began to rebuild on a foundation of growth rather than domination. 3 months after that snowy day when Ben had first led Thunder to safety, William saddled the gray stallion for the first time, not forcing the saddle on, not fighting or restraining, but asking permission and waiting for Thunder to accept. The horse stood quietly, his trust complete enough now that the gear didn't trigger panic. William mounted slowly, feeling Thunder's body beneath him, powerful and alive and choosing to carry him. They walked around the corral together, man and horse moving in harmony, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch erupted in applause. But William barely heard them. His entire attention was focused on the miracle of this moment, on the fact that what he tried to achieve through force for 2 years had been accomplished through patience and respect in 3 months. Thunder wasn't broken. Thunder was whole, was healed, was a partner rather than a possession. Ethan stood at the fence with tears streaming down his face, and when William dismounted, father and son embraced for the first time since Margaret's funeral. "Mom would be so proud of you," Ethan whispered. "You became the man she always knew you could be." That evening, William gathered everyone who worked on the Hartley Crown, along with Ben and Deputy Morrison and several neighbors who'd witnessed the journey. He stood before them in the great room of his house and made an announcement that would reshape everything he'd built. "I'm establishing the Margaret Hartley Center for Equine Healing," he said, his voice strong and clear. "We're donating 500 acres and building facilities to teach Ben's methods to anyone who wants to learn. The old ways, the ways of dominance and breaking, they end here. We're going to show that there's a better path forward, and we're going to name it after the woman who tried to teach me these lessons when she was alive." He turned to Ben, who stood quietly at the back of the room. "And I'm asking you to run it. Whatever salary you need, whatever resources, you'll have them. This ranch broke you financially, but maybe together we can build something that heals more than just horses." Ben's eyes shone, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Hartley, I'd be honored. But on one condition. You teach alongside me. Your story, your transformation, that's what will reach people who can't hear it from someone like me. They need to see that change is possible, that pride can become humility, that strength can become gentleness. You're the proof that no one is too old or too set in their ways to grow." William nodded, accepting the bargain, and the room erupted in celebration. Plans were made, dreams were shared, and the Hartley Crown began its transformation from a monument to conquest into a sanctuary for healing. On the first anniversary of the day Thunder had arrived at the ranch, William stood with Ben and Ethan at the dedication ceremony for the Margaret Hartley Center. The new facilities gleamed in the Montana sun, built with care and resources that William had once poured into expansion and dominance. Horses that had been deemed untrainable, that had been scheduled for destruction, now grazed in the pastures, undergoing Ben's gentle rehabilitation. Students from across the region came to learn methods that honored rather than broke, that built partnership rather than enforced submission. Thunder stood in a nearby paddock, his dappled gray coat shining, his pale eyes calm and curious as he watched the gathered crowd. He wore no halter, needed no restraint. He stayed because he chose to, because this place had become safe, because the humans here had learned to see him as something more than a problem to be solved. William approached him as he did every morning, not with dominance but with invitation, and Thunder walked to meet him halfway. The stallion lowered his head, and William rested his forehead against Thunder's, breathing in sync, two beings who'd both been broken and who'd both found healing in the same place. "Thank you," William whispered, speaking to the horse, to Ben, to Margaret's memory, to the universe that had been patient enough to wait for him to learn. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I deserved it." Thunder's breath was his only answer, warm and alive and full of forgiveness that William was still learning to extend to himself. The crowd applauded, cameras captured the moment, and the story of William Hartley and thunder spread far beyond Paradise Valley, becoming something larger than either of them, becoming proof that transformation was always possible for those willing to surrender pride in favor of growth. The $2 million wager was never claimed because it had never been about money. It had been about a man trying to prove his worth through dominance, about a horse trying to survive his trauma, about the collision between old ways and new understanding. In the end, what William won was worth more than any amount of money. He won back his humanity. He won a relationship with his son. He won the knowledge that strength and gentleness weren't opposites but partners, and that the hardest thing a man could do wasn't breaking something wild but allowing something broken within himself to heal. As the sun set over the Absaroka Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Margaret had always loved, William stood with the people he'd learned to let in, doing the work he'd finally learned to value, living the life he'd been too afraid to imagine. Thunder grazed nearby, free and whole, a living testament to the power of patience, the necessity of humility, and the simple, profound truth that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong and ask for help in becoming better. The Hartley legacy had changed. It would no longer be measured in acres conquered or animals broken, but in trust built, in trauma healed, in the quiet daily work of showing up with openness instead of demands. And that, William finally understood, was a legacy worth leaving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.